There was a time you reached out with open hands, willing to help, willing to understand, willing to forgive. You saw the world through compassion. Even when people betrayed you, you gave them the benefit of the doubt. Even when they let you down, you made excuses for their behavior. You stayed loyal to those who would never even pick up the pieces if you shattered. And when you stumbled, when life bent your knees and broke your breath, they laughed. Not always out loud, sometimes in smirks, in whispers, in silence that screamed, "We knew you couldn't make it." People you thought were friends suddenly became strangers with front row seats to your pain. You thought they would help. You thought they would lift you up. But instead, they looked at your downfall like it was entertainment. They fed off your struggle. They magnified your flaws. They shared your failures in rooms you were never invited to. That hurt differently, not because of what happened to you, but because of who watched it happen and smiled. You realized something chilling. Some people never loved you. They just loved watching you need them. And the moment you were vulnerable, they felt powerful. You were broken, but not destroyed. You wept, but not forever. Because beneath that pain, something began to grow. Stillness. You stopped talking, stopped explaining. Stopped defending your worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding it. You didn't lash out. You didn't fight for their attention. You just went silent. And that silence, it started to echo louder than all your cries ever did, because silence scares people who rely on your reaction to validate their control. When you stopped giving them the drama they fed on, they started starving. You didn't need to announce your comeback. You didn't owe anyone a speech. You just began to rise, quietly, steadily, ruthlessly. That's the thing they never expected. They thought you'd stay down. They thought your silence was weakness. But silence is strategy. Silence is evolution. Silence is the art of letting fools wonder what you're thinking while you rebuild. You became unpredictable, untouchable, unbothered. And when they finally looked around to take another jab, you weren't there. You weren't crying. You weren't explaining. You were gone, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Now, the same people who laughed when you fell, they're the ones watching you from a distance, trying to decode your silence, trying to reconnect with someone they once mocked, trying to access a version of you they took for granted. But that version, dead and buried, you've become a storm wrapped in stillness, a fire that burns without smoke, a soul that no longer begs to be seen. Your silence has become your revenge, not because it hurts them, but because it heals you. And in that healing, you found something they never had. Power that doesn't require permission. Peace that doesn't need validation. And a presence so strong, it rattles their ego without you saying a single word. This is how power returns, not with noise, but with calm, with quiet steps that shake the very foundation of who they thought you were. They laughed when you fell. But now they fear what you've become in the silence, because they don't know what's coming. And that's what terrifies them most. They were comfortable when your pain was predictable. But now you've become unreadable. A mystery they no longer get to solve. A soul they no longer get to access. And that's revenge. Not in flames, but in absence. They wake up and check your page. Nothing. They ask about you in whispers. No answers. They try to provoke a reaction, only to be met with the void. They underestimated what happens when a wounded soul learns to rebuild alone. They thought silence was surrender. They were wrong. Silence was preparation. Silence was training. Silence was the sound of a sharpened blade being unsheathed quietly in the dark, because you were never weak. You were learning who not to trust, learning how to protect your peace, learning how to become the version of you who would never again beg to be loved properly. Your silence taught you what their noise tried to distract you from. Now they see you glowing in shadows, thriving in your own energy, untouched by their games, their gossip, their absence. And what haunts them most? You don't care anymore. You don't need their apology. You don't need their validation. You don't even need their attention. You have turned their laughter into your motivation. You let the mockery echo while you got stronger. You let the betrayal break your illusions, not your spirit. And in the end, you didn't need to fight them. You just had to outgrow them. That's what they'll never recover from. Not your anger, but your evolution, because now they know. They don't get to come back. They don't get to be part of this version of you. You've become silence wrapped in power. A calm they can't predict. A force they can't control. Let them talk. Let them wonder. Let them sit in the echoes of their own cruelty. Because you're done explaining. You're done chasing. And you're done being their lesson. You've already become the consequence. They never expected you to notice. That's the cruel irony of betrayal. It rarely shows up like thunder. It comes in quiet glances, missed messages, laughter that stops when you walk in. You didn't fall all at once. You were slowly pushed by the friend who stopped calling, by the relative who only showed up when they needed something, by the lover who only touched you when it was convenient, by the colleague who smiled in your face while pulling strings behind your back. Little betrayals, drip by drip, until you drowned in them and you kept justifying it. You convinced yourself you were overreacting, that maybe they were busy, maybe you were too sensitive, maybe love means letting things go. So you stayed, and in staying, you slowly gave pieces of yourself away, until one day you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. Where had your fire gone? When did your voice become so small? When did your needs become a burden you felt guilty expressing? You became the therapist in every room, the helper, the listener, the fixer. You wore your strength like armor, and no one cared to ask what it was protecting. And when you finally fell, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, when the weight of everyone else's problems came crashing down on you, who caught you? No one. In fact, that's when the mask of fake friendship slipped off the easiest. That's when you saw their true faces. Not concern, not compassion, just relief that it wasn't them. Some were even entertained. You saw it in the way they shared your story like gossip, in how they smirked behind polite condolences, in how they disappeared when your light dimmed, only to reappear when they heard you were healing. Because to them, your pain wasn't sacred. It was an opportunity, a drama, a weakness to mock, a failure to use against you. And that's when the truth hit. You had been surrounded by emotional opportunists, people who only loved you when you were useful, quiet or struggling beneath their level. People who feared your confidence but adored your confusion. People who stayed close, not out of love, but because watching you doubt yourself made them feel secure in their mediocrity. You weren't just betrayed, you were used, and that realization didn't break you. It woke you. It didn't spark rage. It sparked distance. You didn't scream. You didn't post angry messages. You simply stopped showing up for the performance. No more explaining your worth. No more chasing approval. No more proving your loyalty to people who couldn't spell the word reciprocate. That's when the shift began. You reclaimed your energy. You stopped overextending. You stopped responding to every call, every crisis, every fake emergency that masked their manipulative need for control. You went dark, and that darkness, it wasn't depression. It was clarity. You saw your past from a new perspective, not with nostalgia, but with sharpness. You realized you weren't weak for falling. You were strong for rising, in spite of the knives still lodged in your back. You started watching people differently, not through the rose-colored lens of shared memories, but through the cold clarity of repeated patterns. And those patterns spoke louder than any apology ever could. You began to notice how often they called only when they were bored, how suddenly you became the villain the moment you set boundaries, how their love was always conditional, dependent on your silence, your compliance, your exhaustion. That's when the bitterness began to dissolve, not because you forgave them, but because you finally stopped expecting anything more. You weren't angry anymore. You were done. Done being the emotional trash bin. Done being the afterthought. Done being the easy one they could come back to once they were finished entertaining better options. So you became unavailable. You weren't posting cryptic quotes or trying to make them miss you. You weren't on some petty revenge spree. No, your silence was strategic. It was surgical, because silence isn't absence. It's power. And when you went silent, they started to hear everything they had ignored. Their guilt echoed louder. Their regret grew teeth. Their memories of you became inconvenient truths they couldn't block or delete. You see, people rarely realize the value of your presence until it becomes a ghost haunting their comfort zone. And that's what you became. Not their enemy, not their savior, but a cold mirror reflecting the version of themselves they tried to hide. The user, the coward, the betrayer. The silence made them feel exposed, because without your constant reassurances, without your emotional buffering, they had to sit in their own emptiness. And for people who fed off your empathy like parasites, that was unbearable. But you weren't coming back, not because you hated them, but because you finally loved yourself more than their excuses. And it was then that something truly dangerous awakened in you. Not rage, not revenge, but purpose. You redirected your energy from fixing others to building yourself. You took every broken piece they left behind and turned it into armor. You read the books, hit the gym, cut the toxic ties, found silence that wasn't lonely, but peaceful. You began to glow differently. Quieter, yes, but brighter than they ever remembered. And the world noticed, not just strangers, but the very ones who once overlooked you, the ones who thought you'd stay broken forever. They came crawling back, some with apologies, some with manipulation dressed as checking in. But you You were done being a safe place for people who started the fire. You didn't need to post a single word. You didn't need to prove anything. Your silence was the proof. Proof that healing doesn't need an audience. That you could lose everyone and still find yourself. That growth isn't always loud or aesthetic. It's raw, private, and often brutal. They laughed when you fell, but now they whisper. They whisper because your name is no longer tied to failure, but to transformation. They whisper because your silence is louder than their chaos. They whisper because you became everything they feared you might. Independent, self-aware, and no longer interested in proving your worth. And it stings. It stings them in places pride can't reach. Because deep down, they know you were never the weak one. You were the one with depth. The one who loved the hardest. The one who stayed loyal even when it hurt. And when you finally walked away without a word, you took their comfort with you. Now they sit with that silence. Like a wound that never quite heals. Because some losses don't scream when they happen. They whisper every day after. They say silence is golden. But in your case, it was lethal. Because you weren't just ignoring them. You were removing them. From your mind, from your heart, from your future. No grand speeches, no begging for closure. You let them talk themselves out of your life, and you never stopped them, and that made them uncomfortable. People expect drama when they betray you. They expect shouting, tears, chaos, because that means they still have power. But when you withdraw in silence, that's when they panic. Because silence? Silence is final. It doesn't argue, it doesn't beg. It doesn't entertain their fantasy that they were irreplaceable. And as you healed quietly, they started to spiral loudly. They posted more, laughed louder, tried to appear unbothered. But it was all performance. Because you were no longer in, the audience clapping for their ego. Your absence made them confront a truth they were never ready for. They weren't the main character in your story. You were. And now you were rewriting that story. Without them. You weren't seeking validation anymore. You weren't trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. You accepted the truth. Some people don't want you healed. They want you dependent, doubting, defeated. Because as long as you're broken, they get to feel whole. But you broke that cycle. You stopped trying to make peace with people who were at war with themselves. You stopped showing love to people who only saw it as leverage. You stopped fighting for seats at tables where you were only ever served crumbs. And the most powerful part, you did it all without announcing your exit. No dramatic goodbye, no revenge plot, just a quiet withdrawal, like the tide leaving the shore. And just like that, the landscape of your life changed. You started making decisions for you. What makes you feel alive? What gives you peace? What challenges and elevates you? You stopped being addicted to potential and started honoring reality. Because love isn't proven in potential. It's proven in patterns. And theirs were written in betrayal, apathy, and convenience. So you stopped making excuses for their behavior. You stopped pretending they didn't mean it. Because whether or not they meant it, they did it. And your silence? That was you finally choosing consequences over forgiveness. Not to be cruel, but to be free. You see, some people treat your forgiveness like a reset button. They hurt you. Say sorry. You forgive. They repeat. But when you went silent, you removed the reset. You removed access. And without access, they had to feel the one thing they never thought they would. Your absence, not just your physical presence, but your emotional investment, your care, your loyalty, your energy, the kind that made them feel seen, important, whole. Now, they had to face themselves without your reflection. And what they saw wasn't flattering. You were the best thing that ever happened to them, and they realized it too late, because they thought you'd never leave, that your love was unconditional, that your heart was a revolving door. But now that door is locked, not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom, and that's silence. It's sacred now. It's no longer the void they can fill with guilt trips or sweet words. It's the boundary they can't cross. It's the peace they'll never disrupt again. Disrupt again. Your silence became the void they feared. You didn't need to say anything. You just withdrew. One day, they were part of your world. The next, gone. You stopped chasing, stopped begging, stopped hoping they'd change. At first, they didn't notice. They assumed you were still there. You'd always been there. But this time, they were wrong. It was a slow realization, a creeping sense of loss. They didn't realize what they had until it was gone. And by then, it was too late. Because the truth is this: people don't respect you until you demand respect. They don't value you until you show them your worth, and you were finally showing them. Your absence was the message. It spoke louder than any words could. It was like a mirror they couldn't escape. They had to look at themselves now. They had to face the choices they made. And that's when they started to feel it. The regret, the guilt, the realization that they had lost something irreplaceable. But it wasn't just the loss that stung. It was the fear of never getting you back. They had taken your presence for granted. And now they were scrambling. They tried to reach out, but you didn't respond. Not because you were angry, but because you were done. You were no longer interested in their games. You had learned too much. And what you learned had changed you. You realized you were better off alone. You didn't need anyone to validate you. You didn't need anyone's approval. Not anymore. You had everything you needed within yourself. And the more they tried to crawl back into your life, the more they exposed their desperation. It was pathetic, but it didn't matter. You weren't tempted. You had found peace in your silence, a peace they could never understand. You didn't need them, not for validation, not for love, not for anything. And that's what they couldn't grasp. They were so used to your constant presence, your loyalty, your willingness to give. But now you had become a mystery, a force they couldn't control, a presence they couldn't touch. They were left wondering who you had become, wondering how they could have been so blind. But it was no use. They couldn't have you back. Not in the same way. You weren't the same person anymore. And that was what they feared the most. You were gone. But not in the way they thought. You were gone in a way that made them regret everything. You were gone in a way that made them wonder if they had ever truly known you. You had become something they couldn't define. Something they couldn't put back into their box of convenience. And that was your power. They had underestimated you. They thought they could walk all over you. But now, they realized the truth. You were never weak. You were just biding your time. And when you finally moved, they couldn't keep up. Your silence had transformed you into something unrecognizable, something stronger, something unstoppable, something untouchable. And when they looked for you, you weren't there. You weren't broken. You weren't asking for forgiveness. You had already moved on, moved up, moved beyond. And now they were left with their mistakes, staring at the empty space you once occupied, regretting every word, every action, every moment they took you for granted, because you had turned their laughter into your strength, their betrayal into your fuel, their silence into your power. And now they feared the consequences of underestimating you, the consequences of believing you would always be there. But you were no longer a constant. You were a force that moved in silence, a force that didn't need to explain itself, a force that didn't need to apologize, a force that was too strong to be stopped. They thought they had broken you, but in truth they had only made you stronger than they could ever imagine. And now they could only watch from the sidelines as you rose and they remained stuck in their own mistakes. You had become the quiet storm they never saw coming, and they would never forget it. Your silence would haunt them, because your silence was power, and power doesn't beg. It doesn't plead. It doesn't explain itself. It simply is, and that's what terrified them most. That's what kept them up at night. The thought that they would never get you back. Not the same version of you, the version that was broken and needy. No, they feared the version of you that was whole. The version that had learned to stand alone. The version that no longer cared about their opinions. The version that didn't need anyone to survive. That was the version they had lost. And it was too late to get it back. Because you had already moved on. And now you were free. Free from their manipulation. Free from their lies. Free from their expectations. And that was the ultimate revenge. The silence felt heavier now. It wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating. They could feel it everywhere. In the spaces they once shared with you, in the conversations that never happened, in the empty places where you used to stand, it was like a weight, a burden they couldn't shake off. They thought they could move on, thought they could forget about you. But you had planted a seed that was now growing in their minds, a seed of doubt, a seed of regret. Every time they tried to move forward, that seed grew. It rooted itself deeper. They couldn't stop thinking about you. They couldn't stop wondering what you were doing. They couldn't stop imagining what their life could have been. If only they had treated you better. If only they had listened when you spoke. If only they hadn't taken you for granted. But it was too late now. The door was closed, and you weren't about to open it again. You had built walls they couldn't climb. Walls made from the strength you found in your silence. Walls that protected you. Walls that kept them out. They couldn't get through. No matter how hard they tried, they started to realize something they hadn't seen before. You were never the problem. It was them. It was always them. They had played games with your heart. But now, they were the ones left playing games with their own thoughts. They tried to justify their actions, tried to explain away the hurt they caused. But deep down, they knew the truth. They had crossed a line. a line they couldn't uncross, a line that had made all the difference. Because in the end, silence was louder than any words they could ever say. Your silence was the final answer. It was the final word. It was the final decision, and they had no choice but to accept it. They couldn't rewrite history. They couldn't change what had been done. They couldn't erase the mistakes they had made. All they had now were their memories. Memories of a time when they thought they had control over you. Memories of a time when they thought you would always be there. And now they were haunted by those memories. Every day they wondered what could have been. Every day they regretted the choices they made. But you didn't wonder. You didn't regret. You had moved on, and moving on had given you something they couldn't understand. It had given you peace, a peace they could never take away, a peace that was yours to keep. And that peace, it was the ultimate form of revenge. Because while they were stuck in the past, fighting their own guilt, you were moving forward. You were living, you were thriving, and they were left behind. Your silence had become your strength. Your absence had become their weakness. They couldn't handle it, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't fix it. The truth was clear. You were never coming back. Not to the person they had wronged, not to the person who had hoped for better. That person was gone. What was left was someone stronger, someone who had learned their worth, someone who no longer needed anyone. And that was the message, that was the lesson they couldn't escape. You had learned to walk away, and in doing so, you had learned to stand taller than ever before. They couldn't break you, they couldn't control you, and most of all, they couldn't undo the change they had triggered. Because now, you were the one in control. You were the one who held the power. And they had no choice but to watch you take back everything they had stolen. You had become the person they feared, the person they would never have the chance to know again. And that fear, it would stay with them forever. So while they spent their days regretting their mistakes, you spent yours building a future without them, a future that was brighter, a future that was yours alone. And that was the true revenge. They always thought they had you figured out. They assumed you would always be there, the one person they could rely on, the one person who would never leave. But they were wrong. You were never just someone to keep around. You were never just someone to be taken for granted. You were a force that could break free at any moment, a force that didn't need them. And they only realized that when it was too late. They thought they could play with your heart. They thought they could treat you however they wanted. But they underestimated something important. They underestimated your strength. They underestimated your ability to walk away. And when you did, it hit them like a punch to the gut. They didn't see it coming. They didn't realize what they were losing until it was gone. And when it was gone, it felt like a part of them had been ripped out. Because you weren't just any person. You were someone they thought they could keep in their life forever. But forever wasn't something they had earned. They had taken your presence for granted. And now they had to live with the consequences of that choice. They tried to tell themselves it didn't matter, that they didn't care. But deep down, they knew the truth that echoed in their mind every time they thought of you. They missed you. They missed the way you understood them without saying a word. They missed the way you made them feel like they mattered. They missed the way you made them believe in the good in people. But the worst part was knowing they would never get that back. They would never get back the person who had been there for them when no one else was. The person who had loved them unconditionally, even when they didn't deserve it. That person was gone, and no amount of apologizing could bring them back. They could apologize 1,000 times, but those words would never undo the damage they had caused, the trust they had broken, the promises they had failed to keep. And now they were left with nothing but regret. They couldn't fix it. They couldn't undo the hurt. They couldn't take back the moments they had wasted. And the silence. The silence was the loudest thing they'd ever heard. They thought it was your weakness, but it was your strength. Because the silence spoke louder than anything they could say. It spoke volumes. It told them everything they needed to know. That you didn't need them. That you were better off without them. That they were the ones left holding the broken pieces of something they had destroyed. And that realization, it shattered them. The emptiness they felt was all-consuming. They couldn't fill it. No matter what they tried, no matter how many people they surrounded themselves with, no matter how many distractions they sought, the emptiness was there. It was constant, and it was a reminder of what they had lost, a reminder of the person they had pushed away, a reminder of the person who had walked away from them and never looked back. They thought they could move on, but they couldn't. Because every time they tried to forget, your memory came rushing back. Every time they tried to fill the void, the absence of you consumed them more. They realized now that they had lost more than just a person. They had lost their chance at redemption. They had lost their chance to fix what they had broken. And now, there was nothing left for them to do but live with the consequences. Nothing but live with the fact that they had played with your heart, and now you had taken your love elsewhere. They thought they had it all figured out. They thought they could take the easy road. They thought they could push you aside and keep going, but they didn't realize how much you meant to them until they lost you. They never understood the depth of your love. They never understood how much you gave them without ever asking for anything in return. It was always about them, wasn't it? It was always about their needs, their wants, their desires. But they never saw you. They never saw the sacrifices you made. They never saw the love you poured into every moment, every word, every action. They took it all for granted, and now they were paying the price. But what hurt them the most wasn't just losing you. What hurt them was that they couldn't understand why you left. They couldn't understand how someone could just walk away after giving so much. But what they didn't realize was that your departure wasn't about them at all. It was about you. It was about reclaiming your power. It was about protecting your heart from the damage they had caused. And they couldn't understand that. They couldn't understand why you would choose yourself over them. Why you would choose to heal over staying in the toxic cycle they had created. But that was the thing about you. You had always known your worth. You had always known that you deserved better. And when the time came to make a choice, you chose yourself. And now, as they looked back, they realized how much they had taken from you, how much they had stolen from you. And the worst part was that they couldn't give it back. They couldn't give you back the time you lost. They couldn't give you back the love you had given them. They couldn't give you back the trust you had placed in them. And they couldn't give you back the piece of your heart they had broken. The damage was done, and there was no going back. But they tried, didn't they? They tried to apologize. They tried to make amends. They tried to fix what they had broken. But nothing worked. Nothing would ever be enough to repair the damage they had done. Because the truth was, their actions spoke louder than their words, and you had already heard everything you needed to hear. They were sorry. But sorry didn't change the fact that they had hurt you. Sorry didn't change the fact that they had taken you for granted. Sorry didn't change the fact that you had walked away for a reason. And that reason, it was because you deserved better. It was because you knew you could never go back to the person they had turned you into. And that's what made your decision so final. It wasn't just about leaving. It was about choosing yourself. Choosing to protect your heart from the damage they had caused. Choosing to love yourself the way you had always deserved to be loved. They had always assumed they would have forever. Forever to change, forever to fix things, but forever wasn't theirs to give. You had always been the one to hold the power. You were the one who decided when enough was enough. And when you decided to leave, that was the end of the story. They didn't get a second chance. They didn't get to rewrite the narrative. The damage was done, and nothing could undo it. The love you gave them was a gift. But gifts have an expiration date, and the expiration date had come. What they didn't understand was that your silence wasn't just a response. It wasn't just a passive reaction to their actions. Your silence was an act of strength. It was you taking control. It was you saying, enough. It was you saying, I'm not waiting for someone to love me the way I deserve. You had been patient with them. You had given them chance after chance. But every time you waited, every time you hoped, they let you down. And in the end, that's what made the difference. You realized that waiting for them to change would only hurt you more. So, you stopped waiting. You stopped hoping. You stopped giving them the power to control your happiness. And when you did that, when you took back your power, you became unshakable. They couldn't break you. They couldn't bring you down. You had already moved on. And no matter how much they tried to pull you back into their world, you had learned to live without them. You had learned to live without the emotional baggage they had dragged with them. And that was your victory. Because in the end, you didn't need them. You were stronger on your own. And that strength was what terrified them. They had underestimated you. They had underestimated your ability to walk away. But now, they were the ones left in the shadows of their own regret. And the worst part was that they could never fix it. No matter how much they tried to apologize, no matter how many times they begged for forgiveness. It was too late. The damage had been done. And you had already moved on. The power was no longer in their hands. It was in yours. You had taken your heart back. You had taken your life back. And in doing so, you had taken your revenge. Not through words, not through actions, but through your silence, through your decision to choose yourself. And that silence, it was louder than any scream. It was more powerful than any words. And that was something they could never undo. because you weren't just leaving them behind. You were leaving behind the version of yourself that allowed them to hurt you. And that was the final form of revenge. Revenge. They always thought they had time to fix things, time to make things right. But the truth was, they never really had time at all. Time was something you took back. Time was something you didn't give away freely anymore. When you walked away, you took your time with you, and with that, you also took your future. The future that was no longer tainted by their broken promises. The future that was no longer tied to their mistakes. The future that was all yours to build. They thought that in your absence, they would feel relief. They thought that once you were gone, the burden would lift. But the burden wasn't on you. It was always on them. And in your silence, you made them carry it, the weight of their guilt, the weight of their regrets. It was heavier than anything they had ever experienced, but it wasn't your problem anymore. You had already freed yourself, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. You were no longer a part of their story, and in the end, they had no one to blame but themselves. They tried to tell themselves that they had learned from it, that they would never make the same mistakes again. But those words were just that. Words, and words without actions meant nothing. They could promise all they wanted. They could say whatever it took to ease their conscience. But none of it would ever undo the past. None of it would ever bring back the moments they had wasted. None of it would ever bring back the love they had taken for granted. What they didn't understand was that the damage they had caused wasn't just to you. It was to themselves as well. Because while they tried to move on, they were left haunted by the ghost of you, haunted by the person they had lost. And the worst part was that they could never forget you, because you had left an indelible mark on their soul, a mark that would stay with them forever. And even though they might try to fill the void with someone else, they knew the truth. No one would ever compare to you. No one would ever make them feel the way you made them feel. No one would ever love them the way you loved them. And that realization, that was the hardest part. Because deep down, they knew that you were irreplaceable. But they also knew that they had pushed you away. They had made their choice. And now, that choice had led them to a life without you. A life of emptiness. A life of regret. A life that would never be the same. And as they tried to move forward, they realized something else. They could never have you back. Not in the way they once had. You had changed, you had grown, and the person you were now was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. They would never be able to get you back because the version of you that they had once known no longer existed. And in a way, that was the ultimate form of revenge. You had outgrown them. You had outgrown the person they had tried to make you. And now, they had to watch you thrive without them. They wanted to believe that you would come back, that you would return to them, willing to forgive everything. But that was never going to happen, because you had already moved on. You had already built a future for yourself, a future that no longer had room for them. And as they sat with their regret, they realized something. They realized that you were never their possession to begin with. You were always your own. You were always strong enough to stand on your own 2 feet. and you always had the power to choose. They had mistaken your kindness for weakness. But now they understood, and that understanding, it was the last thing they would ever hold on to. Because now they were left with nothing but the knowledge of what they had lost, the knowledge that you were gone, and that you were never coming back.